Okay, perfect. All right, let's just see. Everyone's good. All right, so hi everyone, and welcome to this year's first episode of our webinar series. My name is Omar, and I'm a second-year medical student at the University of Laval, and I'm also this year's VP Education at CGSTA. And accompanying me today is...
Hi everyone, my name is Prachi. I'm an international medical graduate from India. I finished my master's in global surgery from McGill. I'm one of the co-chair of the CGSTA this year. And thank you for coming here today. I would like to begin by acknowledging that since I'm in Ottawa, I'm on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I also acknowledge that we are gathering here today from many different parts of Canada and across the world. So I would also encourage you to look up the Indigenous land that you are on and their histories and take a moment to reflect on that and acknowledge it. We'll be sharing the link in the chat about the guide to acknowledging the First Nations and traditional territories, so you can have a look at it. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping rules. We'll start by having a quick introduction of the CGSTA, and after that, we'll have introduction of our wonderful speakers today. After that presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. So please ensure that your mics are turned off for the duration of the presentation. And during the Q&A session, if you are comfortable, please feel free to turn on your cameras and raise your hand to ask questions. If you are not, you can also share your questions and comments in the chat. We will be monitoring that as well. And also please note that we will be recording today's presentation and Q&A session, and the video recording will be available with the transcripts in English and French. So with that, I would like to give you a quick introduction about the CGSTA. So those of who are new to the CGSTA, it stands for Canadian Global Surgery Trainees Alliance. It's a national working group affiliated with the Incision, the International Student Surgical Network. CGSTA is a trainee-led global surgery organization with the vision of safe and timely access to surgical, obstetric, and anesthesia care for rural and Indigenous communities in Canada and across the world. Our current national executive team is made up of a diverse group of trainees from undergraduate, grad, and medical students, residents, and early career physicians who are passionate about global surgery. Our goal for CGSTA is educate, inspire, and unite trainees by providing platform for advocacy, research, and mentorship. We are currently representing trainees at 14 local chapters across the Canada out of 16 medical schools. We hope to build the strong networks of motivated trainees by engaging them in global surgery initiatives, fostering local chapter development, and collaborate with the national and international organization to continue working towards the same goal. So with that, I would like to pass on the mic to Omar, who will introduce to our speakers today. Over to you, Omar.
Perfect. All right, so thank you so much, Prachi. So today our topic of discussion is on writing editorials and publishing in global surgery, which is something I'm honestly very personally interested in learning about. With that, I will introduce our speakers for tonight. So we have with us Dr. Shia Ma, who is a PGY1 in plastic and reconstructive surgery at the University of Montreal. Dr. Ma led the International Student Surgical Network, which is known as Incision, the world's largest trainee-led global surgery organization, for 2 years, where she carried high-level advocacy work at the World Health Assembly and organized one of the largest virtual global surgery symposiums. She has published extensively in the field of global surgery and leading various research projects at the current moment and in advocacy work. Our second speaker tonight is Dr. Vervoet, who is a PhD candidate in health services research at the Institute of Health Policy Management and Evolution at the University of Toronto, focusing on health technology assessment in cardiac surgery. So Dr. Vervoet is a co-founder, past chair, and current trustee of Incision. He's introduced the concept of global cardiac surgery to literature and published the Global Cardiac Surgery Initiative to advocate for the nearly 6 billion people worldwide without access to cardiac surgical care. So thank you both for joining us today, and we'll hand over the stage to you now. So you guys can share your screen.
Thank you, Omar, for the kind introduction and for all of the team for inviting us. I hope you guys are hearing me fine. My internet's not the best, so if there's any issue, just let me know. So I'm gonna do a short presentation on publishing global surgery. Let me just share my screen with you guys. Can everybody see this?
Yep.
All right, so I'm seeing nods, so it should be fine. All right, so as Omar said, my name is Shia. I'm a first year resident in plastic and reconstructive surgery at University of Montreal. And today I have the pleasure of introducing you a bit to what is publishing in global surgery like, and what are some of the steps that you can take in order to jump into this world, which is definitely growing and a very, very exciting one. So here are just some of the things that we will address today. Okay, so when you think about global surgery and want to publish in global surgery, one of the first things you think about is, where can I publish this kind of content? And the answer is not that simple, because in all honesty, there's not really a global surgery journal. At least there's not really a global surgery journal that is PubMed index or like recognized enough that that people know that it's the global surgery journal. So here I have a couple of examples of major outlets that have published global surgery papers, editorial, etc. in the past, including some of these where I have, or Incision, with whom I've worked quite extensively in the past, has published in. So we have the World Journal of Surgery, the International Journal of Surgery, the Journal of the American College of Surgeons. They're actually a body that's very supportive of global surgery initiatives. The British Journal of Surgery, which is a pretty high impact factor journal that has accepted quite a few global surgery publications in the past. The Lancet Global Health, a bit of a in all honesty, ambitious stretch, but you never know. They've definitely published things that were related to that in the past, so you never know. BMJ, so British Medical Journal, Global Health, once again, a bit of a global health, so that would also encompass global surgery outlook of the BMJ. Annals of Global Health, kind of the same idea. They definitely have a global surgery chapter or interest in there. The American Journal of Surgery, where there has been, I had a publication that was successful in the past, so I know there's definitely interest in there. Journal of Global Health Science, a bit of a newer journal, but definitely with a very open mind towards global surgery. And of course, there's a lot of surgical specialty specific outlets. So for instance, if I give an example for me, one of our biggest journal is Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery. There has definitely been articles in global surgery published in these outlets. I know that for sure there has been some that have been published in PRS Open, which is the open access version of the Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery journal. So you guys have a bunch of these choices. How exactly do you choose the journal you want to submit it to? So first of all, you have to think about, what is your topic and discipline? What is, does that fit within the scope of what the journal accepts? And that's actually an information you can get on most journal websites. So just go on the website, go to instruction to authors, and you can find information as to what kind of topics they're interested in publishing. Who is your audience? Now that's a bit trickier, because technically your audience is always everyone. But you would probably, with experience, you kind of realize that there are certain types of people who tend to gravitate more towards certain journals. And that's actually kind of interesting, especially if you have a very specific opinion or idea that you want to share with a certain type of group. And I think Dominique will for sure talk more about opinion pieces and editorials, and comment a bit more on that. Another thing you could do is see if that journal has published similar publications in the past. So usually, for instance, like the journals that I showed you in the previous slide, they have published articles on global surgery. So that does show to a certain extent that they are interested in that. Now it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because if they've already published on it, then maybe it also means that they might be less interested in something that is so similar and close. So that's something to, consider, but, it's definitely not an absolute factor. Some people do mind or care if it's open access or not. In a nutshell, open access journals are journals that do not, make their articles freely available for anybody who wants to read them, but at a certain cost usually. So open access journals usually charge the authors who are publishing a certain amount of money, so that it would theoretically cover for the fees of publishing this article and letting it be freely accessible to everyone. Now, it's definitely more complicated than that, but that could be something interesting. Open access definitely allows more people to have access to the content of your article, so more publicity and more chances, for instance, of potentially getting cited or getting noticed. Impact factor is also something that people can consider. So the idea of an impact factor is how influential, between huge quotations, if you want, a certain journal is. So the higher the impact factor, the more influential, or the more it is read, it is shared, it is cited. But on the contrary, on the flip side, it also means that it's likely more hard to get published in. So just something to consider when you choose one. Now, there's this nifty website called Jane, where if you input the title of your abstract or manuscript here, it can actually give you a selection of potential journals that you can publish it in, or that you could at least submit it in. So that's kind of interesting if you want to check that out. So what is required in submitting a manuscript? Usually these things are pretty much always a must. And that kind of depends and varies depending on the journal you're submitting to. A cover letter is pretty much always something you have to prepare. It's we'll go into it a bit more detail later, but it's basically an introduction to your manuscript that the editor will read first. A title page, which includes a lot of essential manuscript information. The manuscript itself, which depending on the type of manuscript, can be arranged, if it's an original article, often as background, methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. Usually that's where you also include an abstract, and abstracts can sometimes even be required for editorials. So that's something to keep in mind. You also include figures and tables, which depending on the guidelines, some of them require them to be separated in another document, and others just follow within the text. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. Supplemental materials, if for instance you have more tables or more figures that maybe are of secondary importance, but that you would still like to include, that's somewhere where you could include, and that can be actually really great material for making your paper stronger. And there's a bunch of other supporting material that journals might require you to prepare, including disclosure forms, sometimes ethics approval forms, patient consent forms if there are patients involved in there, and sometimes many paperwork. So just keep that in mind when you're arranging your submission process. So cover letter, it's basically a one-pager to the editor-in-chief, so the big boss of the journal if you want. And in that cover letter, you should really mention quickly, but in a very clear way, what your research is about. Why is it important? Why should they care about this topic, and why they should care about your article specifically? Why does it fit or what should it be published in their journal. And it's actually something that's pretty important, because a lot of times that's a bit of a make or break for editors as to whether they would even look at the rest of your manuscript. So if they see and they see that your subject is actually something that's not interesting or not applicable for their journals, then that's an automatic rejection, is what we kind of call like a desk reject. Like they kind of look at it and they realize that this is not even worth sending to reviewers. So just be careful with that and put some thought into it. Get familiar with the online submission platform, which I have a little image here. This is the platform of EM, which is, I'm pretty sure, what most major journals use. So it kind of looks like this. Every tab requires you to either enter information or to put documents. So you have to go through all of them in order to submit your manuscript. Title page, have a little example here of what it could look like. A title is not gonna, as you can probably imagine, pretty important, and it's really essential, if it hasn't been repeated enough already, that you follow the journal guidelines. It'd be really annoying, and it is, you know, it is rough sometimes to go through all of the pages of their guidelines, but it is pretty annoying to go through all this work to submit it only to have it bounce back and delayed because, you know, you didn't format it the way they wanted it to be. Abstracts, first and sometimes only impression that people will have of your project. Be concise, be novel, be new, and be honest. You know, whatever result you got from your project or whatever idea you want to convey, just convey it directly. Always a good idea to minimize jargon. Take it with a grain of salt, because sometimes very specialty specific terms are necessary, but also realize that if your topic is very, very specialized and submitting to a more general, if you want, journal, then they might not exactly understand what you're talking about, in which case they might think that it's not a good fit for their journal. Some journals are starting to ask for a visual abstract. Definitely a minority of journals, but if ever they do ask for that, this is an example of something that would be pretty good as a visual abstract. Okay, so good job. You submit your paper. What happens now? So the first step is that it goes with the editor. So either the editor-in-chief or just the office in general, they will go through all of the documents that were submitted, make sure that it's actually properly formatted before they send it to reviewers. And that's where they also judge as to whether it's a good topic or not. Then it goes to review. So it says under review, which is where they select reviewers, so technically experts within the field, that will go through your manuscript and assess it. Perhaps sometimes request changes, perhaps, you know, comments as to the topic. And then it can really go three ways. Either they will require you to do revisions, which is very frequent. It's very rare that a manuscript gets accepted right off the bat for submission. They could be accepted. That's another outcome, which really doesn't happen often. Or they can be rejected after review, in which case the process ends. But if you do get revisions, then you have a certain delay, a certain number of like days or weeks to do it. And then you have to resubmit it, redo the submission process, which thankfully the second time is a bit faster. And then you go through back the loop where it goes to the editor and then goes under review. Say you did revisions and whatnot, and then it gets accepted. Great, awesome. That's when the editorial board will start working on producing the article. And then there's quite a few back and forth in terms of approving what the article looks like, in terms of sometimes signing more form about intellectual property and all that stuff. And then eventually it goes to publication. So the process of publication is actually pretty long. I think the fastest one that I've had was maybe a matter of like a month or two, and the longest one easily a year, which in all honesty should not be the norm that it takes so long, but do know that it can happen. So revisions, they're definitely a good thing. You have to think about it this way. If you get a revision for a manuscript, it means that it was interesting enough for them to not say, we want to reject it. And technically, reviewers are generally experts of the field, and they can really provide good insight as to what can be improved about a project, what can be improved about a manuscript. So consider their comments, even though sometimes you feel like they might not be appropriate or they might be a bit, out of bounds. To consider why they're saying this, and if there's any way you could perhaps, integrate the comments or integrate these suggestions in your manuscript. It's okay to disagree. You don't have to agree with everything that they say, but in your reply, which we'll talk about a bit later, do explain why you disagree and support it with good evidence, ideally with evidence from the literature. What you have to do when you have to do revisions, however, is to produce a point-by-point reply. And that's usually the norm. I don't think I know any journals that do not require one, but basically what it means is that you take all of the comments that the reviewers give you, and for every comment, you answer their comment. So for instance, if their comment is like, oh, please add your thought about, topic X, then your answer can be like, thank you for the suggestion. We have looked into the literature on topic X, and we have added this part. Obviously, the more structured it is, the more information you give in your reply to reviewers, the faster and easier theoretically it is for them review once again your work. So you're really doing them a favor, but also doing yourself a favor. And marked and clean manuscript is usually a good idea. Some journals require it to be a thing when you do revisions. It basically means that they want one copy of the manuscript with all of the changes of the, highlighted, and one copy with the newer version completely clean. So after acceptance, we kind of talked about this already, but you can expect a certain delay before it actually gets published. Some journals do online first, so they publish it online first before they do all the formatting and produce the actual article that looks like an article when, for instance, you look on it online and download it as a PDF. So that being said, there's usually some forms and licenses that you have to, sign or you have to discuss. So just take into account this time that it takes, especially when you're a lot of authors, a lot of people involved in this. Open access, if you have chosen open access, it usually requires article processing charges, which are also called APCs. And these can vary a lot. They can be a couple hundreds of dollars to like thousands of dollars. And that's where it gets a bit scary for people who want to publish open access, yet do not have the institutional support, because sometimes your institution, your school, or your department, or your service actually has a budget for research, in which case there is the possibility of getting some of that funds to pay for these APCs. But honestly, I personally don't know of anybody who has paid, $3,000 to publish an example BMJ from their own pocket, and that shouldn't be the case either. So if you want to submit open access, do confirm or check with the institution or funders. Some people are funded by grants, if you can do that. And sometimes if you are from certain groups or perhaps certain countries, such as certain low and middle income countries, there are waivers and discounts for open access for certain journals, and that's including the big name journals too. So you just want to check that before pre-submission, because usually it requires extra steps in terms of submitting proof and everything. So that's about it for publications. I hope it was interesting and has taught you something. So I'll be happy to take questions at the end. I think I'll just let Dom go on with his presentation first.
Thank you so much, Shia. I'll quickly share my screen. So this will be a tough act to follow, but mine will be more on the opinion end, and I'm hoping, can you see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. More on the opinion end, both on the academic side as well as writing to the public. So one, there's kind of the academic sphere, which is really publishing in a journal, just similar to original research. And secondly, more on the public end, which is what they typically call op-ed writing or columns and so forth, where you're kind of stepping outside of the world of academia and speaking to the public, policymakers and so forth. So this is kind of what I'll be speaking about today. So again, first a bit about academic writing and how opinions fit in there, then writing to the public, then kind of navigating the decision about which to choose. Do you choose one or do you choose both? And then lastly, some tips and tricks for US trainees to kind of consider. So for academic opinion writing, there's basically three major categories, which are a bit of a continuum when you look at it. You have the editorials and viewpoints, which is more of a larger piece where you really support your opinion with evidence and you talk about a very novel topic, similar to general research. A commentary is more of a brief and abbreviated editorial, which is still about a novel standalone topic, but it's much more focused on raising awareness just because of the brevity of a commentary. And then a letter to the editor is generally more of an opinion or a comment that you have about something that's already published, so not something that is standalone as a topic. So to give some examples about this, so editorials, as I mentioned, are a bit lengthier typically. It kind of varies from journal to journal, whether an editorial of a viewpoint is rather brief, which is sometimes 1,200 words like in JAMA, and sometimes up to 3,000 words like in BMJ Global Health. And so it really varies in terms of the length. Typically, it's kind of a specific topic that you want to discuss, but you support it not only with your opinion, but also with evidence, but in more of an informal way than a review. So you really aren't necessarily combing through all the literature, but in perhaps a bit of a biased way, supporting the opinion that you have and the message that you want to convey. Here, you're more speaking to the academic audience, obviously, because you're publishing in journals, but you're really also trying to get a conversation with them because you want to convince them about whichever topic you're talking about, or you just want to share a specific situation that you've noticed and that you want to inform them about. And so a couple of examples you see in the right that we've published over the years in different journals, ranging from the issue of virtual conferences or the power of virtual conferences, but also issues like, for example, how the field of global cardiac surgery in its very early days had a lot to learn from other global surgery fields. And really, it was much less so there about a kind of convincing the audience, but more kind of a sharing of a historical artifact. And so that can really take a lot of forms. You have some journals that also specifically tailor it towards sharing personal pieces. So for example, clinical experiences that you had, situations that you have encountered by performing arts. So for example, where you relate the intersection between medicine and arts and so forth and so forth. So that's really journal dependent and really allows you to be a bit creative as well. Now, commentaries, as I mentioned, tend to be much shorter, and there's fewer journals that publish these just because they generally have an editorial section and a letter to the editor section, but not always a commentary section. The Lancet is one of the few journals that actually does, and that allows people to raise awareness about an issue without necessarily new research, new original data, or an exhaustive discussion. It really allows the writer to share their opinion in a very concise way about a topic that is still relatively new. Now, letters and replies, so letters to the editor are basically a way for you to comment on something that's already published. And it could be that you really agree what's been published, but you feel that there's still something missing. And the two examples that you see here was kind of that example, where the original articles, they were talking about something related to surgery and maybe mentioned it here or there, but there was still kind of an opportunity to emphasize kind of the strength of the results that were published, but that the authors didn't necessarily address in their discussion or in their findings. Could also be that you disagree. So it can be that there's something published, but you feel it is completely wrong, or that you feel that there's kind of something missing, that you feel that the opposite side of the story is still missing, kind of the counter voice, and that you want to share that. And that happens a lot as well. So it really gives you an opportunity to add a fresh perspective to something that's already published, as opposed to kind of redoing the entire process and trying to do the research all over again. Now, writing to the public is very different. You're no longer preaching to the choir. And with that, I mean, you're no longer speaking to the academics who arguably a lot of them already know about the things that you're talking about. If we're looking at CGST and we're talking about global surgery, if we're talking about academics about global surgery, here and there we might still find somebody who doesn't know about it, but to a great extent we might be speaking to the people who already know about all of these things, or to a great extent. And so we really have to kind of move beyond academics and also speak to the policymakers, to the public, and so forth, and make them aware. Now, the problem is, despite the fact that we feel that we're good at writing because we've published a few papers, or we're engaged with a couple of writing assignments, or we've had a couple of essays during undergrad or during grad school and so forth, the problem with academic writing is that it's generally very high level. It tends to be full of jargon, tends to be full of run-on sentences, difficult words that people don't necessarily understand outside of our immediate environments. And so when we kind of want to move from academia to talking to the public, we have to understand we have to talk differently. And so this is a quote by Steven Pinker, who is a professor at Harvard, who kind of really eloquently describes this in a very lengthy article that you see on the left. And kind of makes you think as a reader, if you read that as an academic, well, I thought I was a good writer, but perhaps I'm not. Perhaps what I'm conveying is not necessarily something that is being interpreted that way by whomever is reading what I'm saying. And so this is really why academics should write for a public, to learn how to engage with the public, to learn how to engage with their audience in a more meaningful and direct way, and without using too many fancy words that makes the message hidden, or that makes that the readers just lose their interest halfway down the piece. And so this kind of gives you an opportunity as researchers to get off of your hypothetical ivory tower and really see what the public, what policymakers and so forth engage with on a daily basis, what interests them, what needs that they have, and how you kind of can speak the same lingo to make them aware about whichever research that you're doing or whichever issue you're advocating about. So this is an example of an opinion piece a little over 2 years ago that I put out in BMJ Opinion. And this was about the issue of the fact that people from high-income countries tend to have very easy access to visas if they already need one, because a lot of the passports tend to be directly approved or acceptable for traveling, whereas people from low and middle income countries generally have to request more visas and also have difficulty obtaining those visas. And this is particularly problematic with regards to high-level global health meetings, because if we think about the WHO, if we think about the United Nations, they have their meetings in New York and Geneva and so forth. Really the most expensive cities in the world. And not only is it expensive to be there, it's also hard to reach. It's hard to get a visa to Switzerland, it's hard to get a visa to the US if you're not from a country that has direct access to that. And so there's really kind of that power disparity, power imbalance in global health, perpetuated only by visas in this situation, but it extends far further with regards to getting time off, paying for flights, and so forth and so forth. And so I kind of put this out in a BMJ, and a couple of months later, 2 months later, one of the journalists of Al Jazeera, which is a really large international media company, reached out on Twitter asking for me to kind of comment more in depth about this, because they wanted to run a media piece on this on their channel. And you see in the right bottom that they, during one of their episodes or during one of their time slots, they went over my Twitter thread that I had posted in response to this and over my opinion piece to kind of address some of the issues pertaining to visa imbalances in global health. And so this is kind of a great example that if you kind of reach beyond just academia, you never know who picks it up and really who it can impact down the line. And perhaps one or two policymakers or societal leadership individuals, etc., have seen this or have noticed this and have kind of reconsidered about some of the practices that they have engaged in. Now, similar to letters to the editor in academic publishing, also with op-eds and opinion writing to the public, you obviously have an opportunity to kind of agree or disagree with whichever issue is being published in, for example, a newspaper or magazine. And these are two comments in the New York Times that I put out in response to two different pieces, where on the left, it was with regards to an issue in terms of congenital heart surgery disparities in terms of outcomes in the United States, where I kind of want to elaborate on the fact that the United States has far too many congenital heart surgery programs, mostly because they are very decentralized, whereas most of the world has far too little cardiac surgery or congenital heart surgery programs, if any at all. And so I kind of highlighted that in the opinion piece that I got out of the New York Times on the left. Whereas on the right, it was more to kind of illustrate a very ironic issue. And that was that the United Nations always has their high-level meeting in New York. And it happened that in 2019, they had one on universal health coverage. Now, the United States, for those who don't know, does not have universal health coverage. And it was quite ironic for them, a country with the most spending of any country in the world on healthcare, arguably very, very poor, if not one of the poorest, if not the poorest outcomes among high-income countries in terms of healthcare, that they are engaging in this discussion that 1 in 12 Americans does not have health insurance, and that most or a good half almost of the country's population is underinsured. And so having to pay out of pocket to a great extent, having to incur medical debts, medical bills and so forth that they cannot immediately pay for in a country that spends the most on healthcare and is supposedly in many ways a very progressive country. And so that irony was something that was very shocking to me and that I kind of also wanted to raise in that regards. Now, opinion pieces, again, can also take a variety of forms and it can be a variety of issues. The one on the left top in DevEx was at the early start of the pandemic, where the United States was recruiting healthcare workers from LMICs by giving them easier access to visas to come and support the COVID response in the US. And while it seemed that that was a good thing in the sense that, oh, okay, they're providing an opportunity for people to come to the US for global collaboration to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. But underneath that was kind of the underlying connotation that a lot of people unfortunately missed, hidden in that supposed action of solidarity, was the issue that healthcare workers were being taken away from low and middle income countries, which were already understaffed, which were already under-resourced, and which were eventually going to bear the brunt of COVID-19 burdens to a great extent, at least in absolute numbers, just simply due to the fact that now, as we've seen with vaccine inequities or inequities in vaccine distribution, but also intensive care capacity, PPE, and so forth, there's really that disparity in the US was kind of taking advantage of that very early on, which was a very unfortunate fact. To the right was a mirror of a personal experience. I did half of my intern year in Japan, and being interested in cardiac surgery, I went to the Japanese cardiac surgery meeting. But unfortunately, something that quickly caught my eye was the fact that only about 1 in 100 participants, roughly 1% of the participants were female residents, female cardiothoracic surgeons, and the far majority of them were men. And we know that in North America and Europe, in arguably all countries worldwide, there are gender disparities in surgical care. But it struck to me how apparent and how obvious that was when I went to that conference in Japan. And so it was kind of for me to share that story, but at the same time, raise a bit more awareness about this issue within the context of surgical care. And also interview one of the leading female surgeons in Japan to kind of share her opinion about this in this piece and with the readership. But also it gives you an opportunity to speak to your local communities. It doesn't always have to be big outlets in a language that might not be your native language. My native language is Dutch. I am from Belgium, and in Belgium we have a medical newspaper, which you can see on the left bottom, where I'm a columnist for, and it gives me an opportunity to also speak to quote unquote my community back home, my colleagues, my mentors and so forth, and share my opinion about issues pertaining to whichever that I feel like sharing, pertaining obviously to medicine, to public health, to research, and so forth. And so I also want you to encourage that if you're not Anglophone, if you're not from Canada, if you're calling in from somewhere else, to not just think about Anglophone and major outlets, but also think about outlets that are reaching your own communities and can really have more tangible, sustainable impact. So in terms of op-ed and blog writing, then a couple of tips is that make sure you know your audience, make sure you know who you want to reach, and understand whether they will understand what you're saying. So avoid any jargon. Know your outlet. Make sure if you're talking about medicine, don't go publish in an economics outlet or a politics magazine, and vice versa. Make sure that it's relatively novel to them. You don't want to have something duplicated. Try to adhere to the 80-20 rule. Try to support it with about 80% new info that is new to the reader, and support it with about 20% of your own opinion, so you can kind of mingle that you have a bit of your own story, but that is supported by evidence still. And be patient. It's very normal to be rejected. It is so in academic publishing. It is even more so in op-ed writing. And the greatest writers who publish in the New York Times and the biggest outlets and have New York Times bestseller books and so forth, they still get rejected almost day after day. And so do expect that. That's totally okay. The upside is that the process is a bit faster than in academia, and so it allows you to turn over outlets a bit more quickly. Now, very briefly, in terms of how to choose between both, there is obviously an opportunity to take what you are talking about in medicine and public health and so forth, to take that to the public, but also to a different extent talk about that with the academic audience. And that's particularly something that we've seen with the pandemic, where initially there was a disconnect between what public health responses meant and how that would be conveyed to the public. And it allowed healthcare workers to really, in a way, share their experiences and emphasize the issues that they were facing on the front lines with the public, but also combating misinformation and so forth in a way where healthcare workers, who are generally seen as individuals of authority with regards to an issue like, for example, the pandemic, could share their personal expertise and experiences with the public. It also allows you to really translate some of the research that you have done and translate into a more accessible and understandable lingo for the public. And so that's an opportunity as well to really do both and speak to both audiences rather than just picking one. If you pick one, it's probably because you have a very niche audience, because you're talking about basic science findings which might not be of relevance to the public, or with regards to the public that you're talking about advocacy, and that might not be relevant for academia per se. Or as I said, if you're talking about both, it could be to influence policymakers with evidence that was published, or to dispense issues or findings of public concern. Now, very quickly, and then I'll wrap it up, is how to get started as trainees, some of the tips and tricks. I do want you to encourage, whether in terms of academic writing or opinion writing, to start quickly. I've given a similar talk only once before, which was for the US equivalent of CGSTA, the Global Surgery Student Alliance. And one of the students there kind of took it to heart and went about and started writing. And he, not long after that, he published his first author piece. It was a single author piece, and he published it in The Lancet. So it kind of gives you an idea that even if you're very new to writing, even if you feel that you don't necessarily have something to contribute, we all have our unique backgrounds, we all have our unique experience, we all have our unique perspectives to things. And so I do want to encourage you to kind of get started and get those creative juices flowing. Some brief tips and tricks is just generally to reach out to mentors, to mentees, to colleagues, and discuss with them about issues that you're interested in, speak to others and see what their thoughts are and share some of your own ideas. Along the same line, start reading more in terms of being up to date with the literature, being up to date with what is out there in the news with regards to public health issues and so forth, and start practicing with regards to writing. It's totally okay that at the start it's going to be tough, but it will go easier and easier as you go along, although it will always be to some extent a bit of a struggle. Start to question things and be skeptical at things that you read or see, and question whether there's something wrong or there's something missing, and see what you can kind of convey that is different and fresh to a certain dialogue. And specifically find your niche. If you have a particular clinical interest or research interest or public health interest, explore that a bit further and find what you uniquely have to contribute to that specific dialogue. And my very last slide, my closing thoughts, just some tips that I want to give you as somebody who likes to write but knows that will forever be a struggle, is that writing is not just a one-time effort. Writing will always be a rewriting process where many a times you have to create multiple drafts, you have to edit multiple times and so forth. And that is totally okay because nobody will ever write a perfect piece from the start. With that, I want to kind of convey a quote that I have been passed along, is that if writing is easy, you're doing it wrong. Writing is never easy, and there will always be issues that you find because you can't find the right words, you can't find the right sentences, you don't know how to phrase your argument, and so forth. So that is totally okay. So do definitely get feedback from people outside of your field. If you're talking about global surgery, try and see what people who are outside of global surgery and perhaps work in infectious disease or who are completely outside of medicine think about the issue that you're writing about, and ask them if it makes sense what you're writing. Ask if they understand, because if they don't understand, a lot of people in your audience will not understand. So that kind of gives you an opportunity to rethink, because what you write may seem logical, but what others read might sound very differently. Hold yourself and others accountable, build a bit of a routine for yourself so you kind of keep up that practice, and creativity eventually will follow. You kind of won't have creativity falling in your lap, but it's really kind of a routine that you have to build, and eventually creative juice will be flowing. And you can kind of help others be held accountable and vice versa by getting, for example, pen pals or getting a writing accountability group to ensure that you're kind of keeping yourself and each other accountable for this. And then last and definitely not least is don't give up. It is a very painstaking process in a lot of ways. It's something that you don't have to be discouraged or disheartened by. We all have very unique experiences and unique things to contribute to the literature, both academically and in terms of opinion writing. So keep reading, keep writing, keep trying, and eventually I'm very sure that we'll see a lot of your pieces out there in the media and online. So with that, I want to close. Thank you very much for kindly inviting me to speak about this, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Perfect. So thank you so much to both of you. So I guess the floor is open now to anybody who would like to ask any specific questions. We kind of prepared a few beforehand, but we saw that they were pretty much all touched on, so that was really good. But yeah, great tips, great everything. Let's just see if there's anything in the chat. So there is a. So by Allah, BMJ has a type called personal views. Where does it fit, as a viewpoint or a commentary? Also, can you please talk about a review article?
Sure, I'll quickly talk a bit about the first. Maybe Shia wants to briefly elaborate on the review article. because a review article falls more in the academic sphere. But personal views, when I was talking about editorials, I was mentioning that it really kind of varies a lot, takes a lot of forms in different journals, and the length, the formatting, the kind of type of opinion that you're conveying can really differ from journal to journal in terms of what they accept and what they want to kind of talk about within that given section. So for example, if it is, for example, something that talks about medicine and the arts, it will be something that's pertaining to, let's say, medicine and music, but it won't be something about where you just generally had an experience in on your rounds and it has nothing to do with arts whatsoever. Personal views, I would assume, I obviously don't know all the types in every journal, what it specifically is, but it would very likely be a viewpoint where it's more of a supported opinion that you're conveying that's supported by some sort of evidence in a bit of a more elaborate way than a commentary. Kind of a rule of thumb is that a commentary generally is about 500 to 700 words. It just is just enough for you to convey your opinion, but not enough for you to add a couple of references and really in-depth research or in-depth evidence. Whereas a really bit of a more straightforward editorial tends to quickly be 1,000, even 2,000 or 3,000 words. So that kind of helps you distinguish between those.
Perfect. Dr. Ma, would you like to comment on the review article?
Yeah. So about a review article. So basically a review article is the type of article where you have done some sort of review on a certain topic in the existing scientific literature. Now, there are different types of reviews that you can do, depending on how systematic or non-systematic they are. So I would say like top of the chain, like the most scientific or the most rigorous kind of review that you can do is a systematic review, which means you have a very specific search string that will generate a set of articles that are very specific to a certain topic that you want to explore. And that usually takes a pretty complex, I would say, methodology that a lot of the times people do ask a librarian to help out for. But these kind of reviews are very valuable because they tend to highlight trends or highlight potential findings from a collection of articles and have kind of an overall conclusion about a certain question about a certain topic. They are quite time consuming and they do require some knowledge to properly interpret the results as well. But they're definitely really great and valuable articles. On the other spectrum, you have more of a narrative review, meaning you want to have an idea or to produce a certain kind of perspective on a topic, but you are selecting yourself a few articles in order to support your point. So it's definitely a bit less scientific, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's worth less. It is something that's quite popular for topics where it hasn't been published that much, and you can't really do a systematic review because you just wouldn't yield a lot of articles, period, or any. So that's an option. And kind of in between the two, you have what we call a scoping review, which is a bit of like a systematic review format, but done in a less rigorous way. So I would say these are like the three types of reviews that you see the most. And if you submit this kind of research, then you would qualify that as a review article.
Perfect. All right. Well, very insightful. So with that, I see no further questions. So we'll end this presentation. I would like to take a moment, of course, to thank, both Dr. Vervoet and Dr. Ma again for this, wonderful session and such an amazing presentation. And over here, I believe we have a link to our regional chapters so that everyone could potentially get in contact with them and check out our, our social media pages and websites for updates and upcoming events. So I'm looking to, future collaborate with and future publications with all of you. And thank you everyone for such a great night. So thank you everyone. And that's about it.
Hi, could I just ask a super quick question? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, not a problem.
Hi, thanks for the talk. This was super informative. I just had a question for Dr. Vervoet. I was just wondering if I could reach out to you via email to kind of get a better idea of your path to your research endeavors. And I have similar interests in cardiac surgery as well. So I'd love to kind of hear your path to what you're doing and potentially getting in touch if that'd be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I read your mind. I just shared my email in the chat. So anybody who ever has any questions, feel free to reach out. You can probably find me somewhere in social media as well if you can reach me via email. I'm happy to talk about anything related to global surgery or cardiac surgery.
Sounds great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.